This is week 1 of Watercolor 1, and we will have reviewed all the information about materials that you're required to have. And so now we're ready to do some painting. But it's really important that you set up your system of working so that it's efficient, and also so that you don't run into problems with paint dripping on your watercolor paper, etc., etc. So the way that I've done this, and I'm right-handed, so if you're left-handed, you may want to do this in the opposite fashion. I usually have a mixing brush that is just an old brush, and my number 4 Raphael watercolor brush for painting. I have 2 trays of water, one for cleaning and one for diluting or mixing, whichever. And then I have a tray that I mix my paints in. In this case, we're just going to be using the pigment right out of the tubes mixed with a little water, which I've done ahead of time. So you want your materials to be on your right side if you're right-handed, and your watercolor paper on the left side of you. This is probably the most efficient way of working. The other thing that's really important is that your watercolor block, if that is what you're using, will be at an angle. Now, I have a drawing table here that is automatically at an angle. I might sometimes want it to be a little bit more extreme, so in that case, I would take something that I could put underneath it to give it a little bit more angle. And this is something you may want to do when you are doing your flat washes. The first thing I want to talk about is how to use this brush, because it's how the brush is used and how your hand is in relation to the brush that will give you the best results. There are 2 ways of using the brush. As we spoke about in our video conference, you should know now that the tip of the brush is the point part of the brush that you paint with. The belly of the brush is where either water or pigment is stored and moves down to the point of the brush via capillary action in order for you to have a continuous flow of paint for a given amount of time, so you're not constantly going back and forth to your supply source. The way that this brush works is you can either use the tip of the brush or you can use the side of the brush. It's important also that you have a means of resting your hand. Don't try to paint with your hand floating around on top. You just do not have any control. So I generally, which is why I wear the glove, is I rest sometimes I'll rest my pinky and my wrist on the watercolor paper. You can also use a tool. I don't have anything offhand that I can show you how to do that with, but you can, well, let's try it this way. You can use a tool like a pencil or something with, you're better off with some sort of an eraser on the bottom so that it doesn't move around, and you can lean your hand on that if you don't want your hand to touch the paper. You're better off with a piece of dowel if that's the way you want to work, but I haven't found that to be necessary. So how do we use this brush? I'm just going to take a little bit of this Scarlet Lake that I have. You always want to maintain a point on the brush. If you just use it loaded like this, you see that the brush is a little dull at the point, so you need to wipe it off a little so that you get a nice point. You're going to have a lot of moisture in this brush, and depending on how you're working, you may want to take some of that out, but for this, at this point, we're just going to work with it the way that it is. Now, you can use both the point of the brush and you can use the side of the brush. If you're using the point of the brush, you're going to get very thin lines, and by putting different pressure on that brush as you're working on that point, you will get a variation in thickness and thinness. And this is a really good exercise to try to do, is just changing the pressure on the brush in order to get the line width that you want. If you want a wider stroke, and we usually do this when we are working with flat washes, we want to use this edge of the brush rather than the point. And so what you want to do then is sweep back and forth, and you can see what a nice wide stroke you can get in the process.